Well, good morning. If I haven't had a chance to meet you, my name is Paul. I'm one of the pastors here at Central Avenue Church in Athens, Ohio. It's really great to be with you. So we're in this series together we're calling Asking for a Friend, and we've actually used this series idea before. We did a long stretch of these last year. We talked about subjects like doubt and clergy abuse and women in ministry, and I'm actually thinking about making this an ongoing series that we do maybe once a year just to talk about hard things, different kind of subjects. Now, although our subject matter is serious, I do want to lighten it up a little. So what I did is I asked all of you to share some asking for a friend questions, some fun ones. And of course, you all come through with flying colors. So I just want to share a couple of these with you just to get us started. Of course, the pandemic is still at the forefront of our minds. It's changed the way that we work and live, at least for now. And it's also changing some social norms. For example, I remember when a day not too long ago when you wouldn't dare walk into a bank or convenience store or a grocery store wearing a mask. Now you can't get in without one. But there are still some folks who don't want to follow the guidelines, and so I got questions like this. If someone in a store isn't wearing a mask, is it wrong to stand near them and start coughing uncontrollably? Asking for a friend. Excuse me. Again, that's not COVID. At least I think it's not. This is another one of those deep theological ones. Of course, our move to online worship has included the practice of now celebrating communion or the Lord's Supper together virtually, online. What this means is, in a practical sense, you have to provide your own communion elements. And so someone just asked. We didn't have any pita chips left for communion, so I subbed in shagbark corn chips because they aren't leavened. So the question in our house, are tomatoes considered fruit of the vine, and can we use salsa? Friends, there is such a fine line between humor and heresy, and we cross it so often around here. And finally, I'm guessing that it slipped most of your minds, but if you didn't know, we have an election coming up. Probably didn't hear about it much. It's kind of been in the background, but there is one. And of course, COVID has moved some people to do mail-in voting, early voting, drop off their ballots. And we know this is true because it's all over social media. Can't turn on your feed and not see someone saying, I voted. And so apparently someone has asked, if you voted early but didn't take a selfie, does it still count? Who knows? I hope so. So again, I'm asking for your help. So please send me your asking for a friend humor or questions. You can send them to my email address, or better yet, feel free to post them on Facebook with a hashtag Central Asking for a Friend. It's also helpful to just tag me. So let's pray and we'll get started. God, we come to you now and we quiet ourselves. And we ask that you give us a spirit that is open to your spirit. Give us the ability to not only listen, but to hear and to understand. God, would you lower our defenses? Help us to hear your voice through the voice of others. And God, if you speak to us, we will listen, and we will be obedient, and we will be changed for your glory. And now we pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Amen. So have you ever noticed that you don't have to teach a child the word mine? I mean, you've been around kids, right? Yours, someone else's. They can be amazing, they can be loving, they can be insightful, but they learn that word mine pretty early on. They master that word. Now, over the years, I've taught Lydia a lot of things. I've taught her a lot of words. But I never remember teaching her the word mine. She probably learned it from my wife. Now, we do have to teach kids words like ours and share and give. But mine comes early and easily, doesn't it? See, here's the truth about us. We are clutchers by nature. I am, you are. We work so hard to hold on to power once we've attained it. We clutch possessions and resources and time and energy. We clutch position and attention and status. Even the most mature among us wrestle with letting go. We wrestle with relaxing our grip on that which we hold dear. And friends, we do this instinctively. We do it for convenience. We do it for status. We do it for protection. We even do it for provision for us and our families. We are clutchers by nature. But are there consequences to our clutching? When we hold on to status and power and privilege, are there ramifications even beyond what happens to me or what happens in me? Is it possible that when we clutch, there's a part of us as a larger community that suffers? And what happens when groups and families and systems and structures clutch? Can we do serious damage to others? And here's the question that we need to wrestle with today. What happens when a people, maybe even an entire race, clutch for generations? Day after day, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation, striving to hold on to power and status and stuff. What happens then when people who have the power, have the position, have the status, what happens when those people make the rules? When those people write the laws? And are there ramifications that reach beyond the generations into future generations? Well, friends, theologically speaking, this propensity toward clutching is what we're continually warned about throughout Scripture, particularly throughout the New Testament. Over and over again, we're called as followers of Jesus to be people who lived with unclutched hands in terms of money and position and status and power. We are called to live clutchless lives with each other and with the world around us. Not only that, but throughout Scripture, we're reminded that there is a better way. There is a better reality than a life of clutching and fear. There is a better reality than simply just holding on. And friends, this is counter to everything that's in us. And honestly, I believe that this kind of life is only possible supernaturally when God daily removes our hearts of stone and gives us hearts of flesh. Of course, one of the greatest places to see this lived out is the book of Philippians chapter 2. I believe this text is so central to how we understand life and God and relationships and community and even our purpose. And we've looked at this a lot over the years here. And I'm actually working through a series on the book of Philippians for us as a congregation. And so this passage is so critical to Christian theology. In fact, if you don't know, most scholars agree that Philippians 2:11 through 18 is one of the earliest hymns of the church. This is why in your English Bibles, it's often separated out as a quote. Paul breaks into song. So just a bit of quick background. In the book of Philippians, Paul is writing to a church. You can read about this church in Acts chapter 16. It's a new church. It's the first church on European soil. And I thought it might be helpful for you to see where it is. And of course, that means we need a map. Yeah, I'm just trying to give you the appropriate time to type whoop into the chat. By the way, it's nowhere near as much fun on video than it is live. A little more context, by the way, this is from my daughter. Philippi was a city where a woman named Lydia was living. Lydia met this man named Paul, and Paul shares the gospel with her, and Lydia becomes the first Jesus follower. Actually, Lydia is regarded as the first documented convert to Christianity in all of Europe. So the birth of the church in Europe starts with Paul sharing the gospel with this woman named Lydia. Now, Philippi also had little or no Jewish presence in the city. So the Philippian citizens were primarily worshiping traditional Greek and Roman gods and goddesses. And we have to understand, and this is why I wade into all this, these gods and goddesses were known for gaining and holding on to power at all cost, even at the cost of the lives of their subjects. Subjects gave their lives for the gods, not the other way around. And so in chapter 2, Paul paints this picture of how they should live together in community. This is Philippians chapter 2, verse 2. It says, "Therefore, If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit or fellowship in the Spirit, any tenderness or compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. In your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. Now, friends, I believe that these are some of the most profound words ever written. Look at this, verse 6. Jesus, who being in very nature of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be held onto, something to be clutched. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. There's a writer, a preacher named Peter Story that says that the crucifixion of Jesus, if you think about this, the crucifixion of Jesus began long before he was born. It began in eternity. Now think about this. The crucifixion of Jesus began with this decision in the heart of God to journey from power and glory to vulnerability. The God of the universe makes a conscious decision to journey downward, to be born as a baby in a finite world. Friends, if you are a Christian, our redemption begins with the willing and loving release of privilege and power. The salvation of your soul, the healing of the nations, the restoration of the world begins with the letting go, the unclutching of privilege, and by none other than God himself. And so Paul says to us, in our relationship with each other, now we should have that mindset. So we are in week 3 of a series where we've been talking about race and racism. And friends, we all know that racial tensions have elevated here in the U.S. We're going to talk about this more next week, but of course, nowhere is this more graphically illustrated than the shootings and violence between particularly white police officers and black men and women, many of whom were unarmed. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Jacob Blake. These shootings have led to all kinds of expressions of grief and anger and, of course, protests, demonstrations, even some retaliation. Now, of course, and this is the scary thing, these acts of violence are not new. What is relatively new is that we're living in a world where we're carrying around cameras all the time in our phone. You think about this. For the first time in human history, because of the power of our phones, we can watch events unfold as they are happening in real time. And so any news of racial conflict is immediate and it's public, and there are fewer and fewer things that are hidden. So while many of us feel like there is a sudden increase in racial tension, the even harder truth is that this kind of thing's been going on for a long time. We just didn't have eyes to see it. And the harder truth yet is, and I said this last week, is that many of us didn't see it because for most of us, we don't need to. Racism doesn't involve us directly. Our world is going along just fine. And this not need to is at the heart of the idea of privilege. And friends, if we're going to think about race, if we're going to think about racism, if we're going to really have this conversation born out of listening, we have to wrestle with this idea of privilege. Now, I don't know about you, but when I heard terms like privilege, and let's be specific, white privilege, I have a tendency to lock up. I have a tendency to get defensive, to deny that it exists. I tend to think it's political or partisan or whatever. And what I'm finding is that, particularly as I've been listening to my black sisters and brothers, is when you are the one with privilege, you don't always understand or see the implications of your privilege because you don't need to. And that privilege itself, and this is not always intentional, sometimes a privilege blinds you to the hurts and needs and experiences and voices of those who don't have it. We don't see them. This is the nature of having privilege? Well, on a theological level, this idea of privilege, one of the ways you can think about privilege is the consequence of generations of clutching, of holding on, of not letting go, generations of not putting the needs of others above our own. Starting with individuals, but building into families and systems and structures and institutions and even nations and races. And so what would happen if we, starting with us, starting with the body of Christ, and let me just say this, I'm speaking to those of us who are white, what would happen if we just started to relax our grip? What would happen if we began to let go of privilege and power and status and even wealth? Friends, I think it'd be incredibly powerful. And I think we'd better reflect the image of the God who made us and redeemed us. So look back at Philippians chapter 2. We've looked at this before, but one of the great insights into the nature of God that I've ever come across was in this passage. And I originally first heard this in seminary. Later, I read it from a Greek professor. His name is Jerry Hawthorne. And this idea focuses around verse 6. Jesus, being in very nature God, and remember that line, Jesus being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage, and so he released it. The New Living Translation says he gave up his divine privilege. Now what's going on here? Why did God in Jesus do that? Well, if you look at verse 6, notice the word being, Jesus being in very nature God. The word being is a participle. You probably remember this from elementary school because it's something that you should never let dangle. That's how you remember participles. It says Jesus being in very nature God. Hawthorne says that how we think about that word being is key to our understanding this passage. Now, when you think about Jesus being in very nature God, how do you think about that? How do you translate that in your head? Well, I think most of us tend to think about it this way. Jesus, in spite of the fact that he was in very nature God. Right? Jesus, in spite of the fact that he was in very nature God. And from a human standpoint, this makes sense. This is the way that we think about it. If I'm God, I don't have to give up anything. That's the good thing about being God. So Jesus lets go of privilege in spite of the fact that he was God. So he didn't need to. Maybe he didn't even want to, but he did. But Hawthorne says that if you understand the grammar and the context, if you understand the flow of Paul's argument and what he's saying about God, it's actually the exact opposite. In other words, maybe we ought to think of it this way. Your attitude should be the same as Christ Jesus, who precisely because he was in very nature God, precisely because he didn't consider equality with God as something to be held on to, something to be grasped. Jesus let go of the privilege of God. Friends, Jesus let go, Jesus stopped clutching, Jesus came in the form of a servant, not in spite of the fact that he was God, but precisely because he was God. So when Jesus came in the form of a servant, he wasn't disguising God's nature. He was revealing God's nature. See, when we who have power and privilege, when we give that up, when we let it go, when we consider others' needs as better than our own, when we stop clutching, what we're doing is we're reflecting the very nature of God to the world around us. So what does it mean for us in this area to give up privilege? I don't think that there are simple solutions. I really don't. But I do think this. I do think it'll be hard. I do think it'll be difficult. And I do think it will require some intentionality by those of us who have power and privilege. So rather than hearing me drone on about privilege, I've invited my friends back to share some thoughts about it. And I have a series of questions for them. And then what will happen is we'll come back and then I will offer a prayer and a blessing and just a small homework assignment. So we welcome our friends back. Today we had a conversation around the whole idea of privilege and specifically the idea of white privilege. And so rather than define it, which I didn't do in the message, I thought it would be more interesting to have you all talk about what is white privilege to you? What is it not? And maybe what's kind of some history around that. So next thing I'm going to ask you, by the way, is when have you experienced the other side of it? So save those stories. But so I guess the first thing is, what is white privilege?
I would say, first and foremost, white privilege is not having to think about anything. That sounds really silly, but when I walk into a space as a Black person, and specifically as a Black man, I'm very cognizant of everything around me. I'm cognizant of how I am perceived, but also what is my literally inhabiting space, how does that impact everyone else around? It makes me walk on pins and needles. I'm not a big guy. I'm a very skinny, scrawny dude who is not even, I say 5'10" because it looks great, but that's really rounding up. I think that's being generous. And yet I have been described in the stereotype as a big Black man. I make sure that my presence, if I'm walking on a sidewalk, I make sure that I am comfortably far enough away, or I make enough sound so that somebody knows that I'm coming, so that I don't have to, like, they don't get shocked or surprised. Also, the way that you are, so using you, Paul, just the way that you talk and just live life, that is considered the norm. When I talk to you in this same tone of voice, I'm talking white. If I talk with a urban or Ebonic or ethnic tone or whatnot, it's friend, hey, Daryl, talk Black. Show them how you can talk Black. I'm not talking Black. I'm just talking. All these different facets of just being a human being and living takes on an entirely different meaning and a higher level of consciousness than is required from my white friends.
Yeah. So as far as trying for me to define white privilege, I think some people hear that and they start talking, they think, are you saying I didn't have to go through hard times? And I come back to the fact that it's not that you lacked difficulties in your life. It's not like you have had no unfortunate situations, but bad things that happen to you, unfortunate things that happen to you, is not because of your color. It's not because of your race. And so for a person to not have that, where you have to be concerned, there's people right now. I remember times, specifically one time I got lost. Ivy and I were out driving and we were trying to find a certain person's house, and I had to stop and ask someone. So I went up, I was so free that I felt I could just ask. So I went up to this guy's house over there off of Richland Avenue, and I knocked, and she's like, oh, just come on, let's go. And I knocked on this neighbor's door, and the man was so afraid, get off my porch. He started yelling at me right away, and he saw me, and it's like, I'm going, get out of here, beat it, I'm gonna call the cops. And I just thought, wow. I just went on and left and rolled out. And I know good and well that my friends who are white would not have to deal with that same thing. As Daryl mentioned, I probably whistle. I'm musical anyway, but I whistle, I smile, and I put a smile in my conversation because I probably grew up knowing to do this because it's disarming. And so because I know sometimes I've had people respond to me and they really don't know me, just assumed I was an angry Black man. And so that's it's difficult. So that's what I think of when I think of white privilege. When you go in and you fill out your application, truly it's just going to be on the merit of your skill, your education, what you've done in your life experience. For me, I got to be concerned about do they really, I mean, even the way someone might explain something to me, are they explaining more because they think he's not getting it?
Yeah, that is something that I experience a lot
So,
before people get to know who I am and my background. I find that people over explain to me. And I wasn't I wasn't exactly sure if they over explained because they thought I was 12 or if it's because I'm African American. The older I get, I'm like, okay, you're over explaining because you African American. But when I was younger, I was more apt to think that they were over explaining because they thought I was very young. But to me, white privilege is not having to have the talk with your black son. That is that is white privilege. I am constantly, and Otis is too, we are constantly saying to our children that, because our children have kind of a low affect in terms of expression. Um, and for my son, he's a large black male, when people, and we know what the studies say, you look at an African American male, and usually people put on about 5 to 10 years on top of their actual age. And so our son, he's a large African American male, and to a lot of people, they would think that he's just mean because he just has a very low affect, just a very low expression on his face. And we're constantly telling him, you have to be concerned about the way you present yourselves to people. If you are, you have to understand that this is tied to race and how people are going to perceive you. And I wish that I didn't have to have these conversations with my children. It angers me.
If I can add into what Ivy just said, I think that is one of the biggest things when you look at privilege, that conversation. And I'm going to tell a story really quickly, and it's actually my son's story. So my son is a black male, but he is fairly light, and he has lighter hair and light eyes. Once you get close enough to him and you see how tightly curled his hair is, then you realize he is black. But before then, a lot of people see him from far away, he's white. And some years ago when he was in high school, he was doing something for his video class with some friends, most of them being white, and one was biracial, but he looked more white. And they had made paper guns, and they were doing this thing for a video class, and someone called the police on them. And the police stopped them, and they showed them the paper. And my son said to me, he said, "Mom, I realized that if I didn't look the way I did, that probably would have ended up being different." This came to me from a 16-year-old boy who knew at that point that his lightness made a difference in how the police saw him, that they didn't automatically assume that he was black. And that crushed me because I want my son to be proud that he's black, and we shouldn't have to pass. And I think when I think about privilege, it's about the idea that things that have to do with white people in this country are normalized, and things that have to do with black people are not as normal. So like we were talking about, I just ordered online Band-Aids in my skin color. When I was in Athens, I could not ever find pantyhose that were in my color, could not find makeup in my color. These things that seem normal. I couldn't find anybody to cut my hair in Athens. Because only the couple people who I spoke to who said, "Oh, I can cut your hair," all they wanted to do was straighten it, then cut it. they couldn't handle it, all of this. And that is part of that privilege. It's like Otis said, it's not that, you didn't go through things, but it didn't have to be because of your race that anything was an issue. And it's like I said a couple of weeks ago, we succeed in spite of. And so when I think about that level of privilege, being white is normal. I've been told my hair is not professional because it is not straight. Just like Daryl was saying about the way we speak, there's a thing called code switching. if people have heard of this. It's how you talk. And I think everybody does it to a degree. It's how you talk around one set of people who you're more comfortable with than the other. But it is definitely something Black people do, professional Black people. We may talk a certain way together, but we go into a meeting, we make sure that we are speaking as properly as possible, because if anything comes out, many times people are going to assume that you're not as intelligent, and that like we said, you can't keep up. So there's a lot of facets when it comes to white privilege. And I agree, it's not about that, you know, you didn't have to go through things, you didn't struggle, but your race was not an issue. Your race never held you back. Nobody questioned you just on the color of your skin. And that's where that privilege comes in, specifically in this country. If you look at our government, it's mainly white men. The majority of it is. If you look at television, we're just getting to this place. I mean, what has it been, 20, 30 years? You know, that's why the Cosby Show was such a big deal, I think, for Black people, because you finally had normalized Black families. Before then, we were always criminals, or we're always the help. You know, and I think it's about looking, when we're looking forward, we got to look at normalizing people of color in this country in every position.
That was
I
a
said, you
good-
better preach, girl.
Uh,
switching.
I was all over the
Yeah.
place, but I had a lot to say. I'm sorry.
that was beautiful.
Yeah.
I really don't have a whole lot to add with all of that. I mean, I agree with what everybody said. Privilege, the only thing I could think of was it's the norm. It's just what everybody's doing. It's just the thing that it's just accepted in this country. And I mean, everybody gave such great examples about how privilege is in this country. I mean, Robin, the hair thing, oh, yeah, you just need to get your hair cut by a few people who don't know how to do it a couple of times, and you're like, never again. It's not going to happen again. I can't do this again. And you really, there is a difference between, you know, getting your hair cut by somebody who can cut black hair and somebody who can't. I mean, just television, media, the majority of, when you see the people on the magazines and things like that, shoot, even like Black entertainment, like BET, like these are specific things for Black people, but like you don't need that if you're a white person. I mean, how many stations have the majority of people on there that are white? I think the biggest thing for me, at least for right now, it's just privilege is no matter where you go, you don't stick out. Like you could fit in places and you're not the token white person. You're the default character. And I think some people have never experienced what it means to truly be in the minority. The analogy that I give is, and it's not perfect, but it's like going to a party and you're wearing a different colored shirt. Like if you went to a party and you were just by happenstance wearing a green shirt and everybody was wearing a blue shirt, like even if no one said anything to you, I have a feeling that most people would feel out of place. And a lot of people have never experienced that. And I think that's what privilege is. You've never had to stick out or defend yourself or really say or try to be anything different. Like you can't really, there's no need to express yourself when there's no need for your culture to express itself when your culture is winning. And so much about white culture is so indoctrinated. And shoot, a lot of people, like you hear white culture and a lot of my white friends are like, well, what is that? I mean, are you talking about like, I don't know, a certain thing or a certain band or a certain type of music? Stop it, Josie. But what it's, like, you don't even realize that that's part of your culture because your culture is so, it's so throughout this country. Phrases like, oh, they don't have a normal name. Well, what's a normal name? Like a normal English, like a normal English name, like shoot, my name's pretty English. Maybe, I mean, some people my name was almost Jamal, and I guarantee my life would have been different if my name was Jamal. So it's not even realizing that your culture is so far ahead and it's so pervasive. I think that's what white culture is, or what white privilege is.
Well, There's 3 points I really want to make.
Mhm.
After listening to this, I think is pretty appropriate. Number one is that white privilege has the underlying presumption of good. So to be white in America means that if something happens, I am assumed innocent until somebody proves otherwise. It means that if there is something dangerous happening or I'm concerned, then it is a good, safe, and advisable thing for me to call the police to search for this. These things are common for white people to believe. Number two is it's not bad. For the most part, those things are not bad. You should be able to call the police. You should be assumed innocent until somebody proves that you are not. Those things are not bad. And it's hard because we've talked about it before. A lot of people, and especially a lot of people at Central, will want to say, I'm not racist. I don't hate you. I think that you should be treated equally and that the cops should treat you fairly. Yes, 100%. They should. The difference is that's your default. Ours is not that default. So yes, we can talk about the things that are significant and should be talked about, hair and professionalism and the way we speak. But even on top of that is the base underlying things of innocence, of if I were to go and I see a white person from a distance, because of my indoctrination of growing up submerged in white culture, I assume that person is a good person that is going to be kind because they just are a person. What we are met with is we assume, oh, that person is a single parent who's on food stamps, who is dangerous, who listens to rap music, and so he cusses and calls each other this, that, or the other. That level, there's not that base level. And the third thing that I would say, I'm so glad that Robin brought up code switching, because not only is it a technical term, is it a scholastic term, but I would argue it is a theological term. Because the Apostle Paul says, I became like the Greeks to the Greeks. I became like the Gentiles to the Gentiles. He said, I became all things to all people that I might win some. Here's the difference for our community. We become all things to all people that we might be safe. Might be safe. Not that we will, but that we might be safe. And that's our default. That's the privilege that our white brothers and sisters get to walk in that we don't.
That was good.
Preach.
Yeah,
Yes.
that was good.
Yeah.
So can I ask you, JB said a while back, he talked about BET and Black Entertainment Television. What do you say to people? Because I've heard people say this before. Well, you know, there's Black TV and there's historically Black colleges and there's Black churches. Why aren't there white churches? I'm pitching you a softball here, but that seriously, I've heard people say that. Why do you differentiate?
Because you don't need it. You don't need it. Privilege. I mean, shoot. Why would you need a white entertainment television network when you have so many? You want one specifically for like white people, like on top of all the other ones that you want? Like, why else do you need more? Like, what possibly else like could you want? Like, I think that's what privilege is. You just don't understand that it's the norm. Like, if you look at just how many people are just, oh gosh, there's this whole wall of medical doctors, you know, these famous medical doctors who've been through my hospital, and like I just see them, and it's just like, how many white faces do I see there, and how many, you know, Black faces do I see there? There's not that many. It's just, why would you need something? Why would you need more points when you're already winning?
And then that question of HBCUs, historically Black colleges, when people ask that question, I try to not be perturbed, because the level of ignorance to ask that question is odd to me. Of course there were Black colleges, because Black people weren't allowed to go to white colleges. And these colleges have persisted because people of color paid for them. That's the reason why we have Black colleges today. It wouldn't have been necessary if people of color were allowed to go to white colleges. It's the same thing between, like, you know, the United Methodist Church and the Free Methodist Church. You know, there's a Free Methodist Church because in that particular region, Black people weren't allowed to go to the Methodist Church. So I just don't. So sometimes when I hear that question, it's hard for me to not feel as though the person is being facetious. I mean, really? You're asking that? I don't understand how you don't understand.
There's just some who they truly don't understand.
Yes, that is true. That is true. You are absolutely right.
Go ahead, Rob.
I was going to say, and I don't know if this is the right message for this. I took a class this summer through Yale, and I would suggest that anybody take it. If you Google African American history class, Yale, it's a free class. And it is probably the most amazing class. And there's a lot of things that people question that I don't think we realize how much history we're not taught. And this goes back to what Ivy was just saying. If you understand that most of these things started because we had no space, we weren't allowed in space, so we just created our own space. Then you understand that it's a question without any merit.
Yes.
You know, and so I would highly suggest if people want to learn, they take that class. It's a free class. You can just watch the videos, and the lecturer is actually now the first African American president of Rutgers University, and it was an amazing class. And if people really want to understand why there's such an issue when we're looking at privilege and we're looking at these things, when you listen to this class, you will realize how much Black history is left out.
Yes.
And that's where, to me, the crux of this comes in. Even in our history books of what we're teaching our children, we are leaving out history of people of color, and not just Black people, also looking at Native Americans and Hispanics and, you know, other people of color in this country. But when we're looking at Black people, we really do not understand how much is left out and how much people of color have had to fight in this country to have anything.
Yeah. I mean, we had to fight to go to war, for crying out loud.
And then when we came back, we were called nigger.
Absolutely.
And we didn't get the benefits that established the wealth that created the systems that are now in place to keep us down.
Right.
Absolutely.
Exactly. This makes me think of the Tuskegee Airmen and how many of those men had PhDs, and they've led fighter pilots across and got all of these people to safety. Never lost a squadron. And after they get out, they get to be custodians and janitors. It's infuriating.
I would say as well on top of that is why. So the question then typically goes a step further and say, well, now Jim Crow is gone. Why do we still need these things? I would argue we need it because in those spaces, we've not excluded anyone. You're still welcome. You go. I have a good friend, white as the sun is bright, that graduated from Howard University.
Yeah.
Our spaces that we make sacred for ourselves because we had to are still welcoming open spaces. That is not the truth for us going into other spaces that are predominantly white.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think sometimes we lack common sense at times. I think of it on a very simple level, and that's if I'm driving a car and turning it right is going to take me off a cliff, I want all the left I can have, right? I'm not going to be turning left and saying, well, why are you not letting us go right as well? Well, we're about to go off a cliff. We need to go left. Well, the problem is, and just like Daryl said, the default. And when you said default, I was thinking benchmark, and I like that because really we're already below the benchmark or below the default. So just because we're trying to bring that up, you're going to have to put focus on the area where there's some type of deficit. And don't be upset because we're trying to fix that specific area. Of course, there's going to be a need for it. And just like JB said, you know, all the other industries or all the other companies, they are predominantly white. It's strange when you have one that's a Black owned. So,
Yeah.
We had one half black president, and you would have thought that the world like just went upside down. Like it's just crazy. Just that, not to get too political, but you would have thought the world exploded. Like just even having a person of color try to run for president, and just hearing the things that people were saying, such horribly like flat out ignorant racist things, and saying that the only reason he got there, was because he's black. And it's just like, and I wonder how many people think about affirmative action like this thing that's unfair. But when you realize that this was created because there was a deficit. These programs were created because there was inequality. If we didn't have the redlining, if we didn't have, jobs that had signs that said, colors need not apply, we wouldn't be doing this kind of stuff.
Would you all mind talking a little bit about the concept of reparations and maybe how you see that? How would you see that working out? First, would one of you define it for us? And then anybody want to talk about that? Because that's kind of aligned with where we're going. So
I think just simplistically, reparations is when you monetize a wrongdoing. And I think a lot of times when people think of reparations, they think of like reparations in terms of slavery, but you can look at World War I and, France and Britain wanted Germany to pay reparations for everything that they did and how they caused that war. And so, but, I think a lot of people forget that. They think about reparations only in terms of slavery of Black peoples in America. But just simplistically speaking, I think it's monetizing a wrongdoing.
That is the literal definition of it, is that you are making amends for doing something wrong with money.
Mm-hmm.
It's striking to me because this is not a new A, conversation, or B, concept. It's something that goes back ages throughout multiple cultures. And even within America, we have several instances whereby the US federal government has paid reparations to different people groups. The only group for whom they not only won't do it, but won't entertain a conversation. And when there is a conversation, it's either shouted down as ignorant or it's not fiscally responsible, is us.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, the fiscality of this country, the wealth of this country was literally built on our people.
Yeah.
But when we want to have a conversation about it, well, that would just blow up the deficit. Y'all, we are trillions of dollars in debt. We're not paying it back. The country lives off of debt. The country was founded on debt. So what's a little bit more? I'm just saying. And this is coming from somebody who's worked in finance and financial services for a decade.
Paul, when you think of it, it's like you can't just throw a switch and say, okay, you're now on even playing ground. If we could be, we're not on an even playing ground. But let's say everything was back and okay, we truly have the same access as everyone else. You still have the deficit from the years of being held back. Okay, so inheritance that's passed on to children, generation after generation, they're already ahead of the game. And here, all these years, people, not only have your families been split and separated and gone different ways, and so the momentum that you could have had, even if you were on a level playing ground, that's gone. You don't have any momentum. And so we're already in a deficit. We're behind. And so you've got to do something to make it right. Now, I can't tell you clearly what I think that is, because at times I think people just think you want a handout and they just don't understand the concept. It's not about a handout. It's about being deprived so long, and you can't just say, okay, now you here, okay, there you are. Now you have access. When, white folks have had the ability to thrive for so long, it's a part of that's a part of that white privilege. It's there.
It's really important here, based off of this conversation, especially who's watching this, to be clear about the differences in viewpoints. So I fear that a lot of our white brothers and sisters who will hear this will think about it in the context of themselves as a person. And that is honestly a privilege in and of itself. White people get the ability to be an individual. Each one of us lives as a collective, we're viewed as a collective, and the oppression that we've seen has been widely oppressive to the entire collective. When we talk about white privilege, yes, you can have the one-offs of people who, I didn't have wealth, my parents didn't pass me anything, yada, yada, but by and large, the entire collective has. What does that look like for, let's sit and contextualize it to an individual who grew up in Athens County, who maybe grew up well below the poverty line, because we know it's one of the poorest places in America? What does that look like? Well, what if you lived in a house that had been owned by your family for a while, or you all lived together, so pay that rent, if you had it, was very, very low. You didn't have to worry about people spiking it up because of who you were, or trying to say that you couldn't live there because of who you were. These are things that for us, even if we were in the biggest of cities in New York City, and if we were living in Athens County, it would be no different, period.
I think it's also important to mention the why in terms of just the thing about white privilege and how people of color are viewed in this country. I think it's important to not forget the why. For people of color in this country, there has always been an association with deviancy. So you, as a person of color, can't do this because there's something in your culture, there's something in your race that makes you not smarter, that makes you more prone to violence, that makes you more prone to sickness and disease. And honestly, I firmly think that part of the reason why COVID is being ignored is because it is disproportionately affecting people of color. But that's another issue. But it's just the whole why people of color are viewed in a certain way is because of its link to bad versus good. And so, this is why we have affirmative action. This is why there are merit-based programs, so that people can have an opportunity to see that, okay, Ivy can do this if she's given the opportunity. So, or given put in a pool where people don't think that she belongs.
Can you all, so obviously the vast majority of people who are going to be listening, watching, will be white. And as we talk about this stuff, oftentimes there are feelings of guilt that are stirred up. You know where I'm going with this. Can you talk a little bit about the concept of white guilt? And as someone who's, we're all listening to you and we're wrestling with these concepts, and some of them push against us and we're like, well, I don't know exactly how I feel about that, yada, yada. Do you have any words of advice for us on how we can work through this? Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
I think about the difference between condemnation and conviction. So when I think about condemnation, so spiritually, that just brings you down and makes you depressed and sad. And I think when you have a conviction, when you're convicted about something, it should spur you to do better, to do good, to make change. And I think that when we look at the idea of white guilt, you can either let it do two things. You can let it condemn you, or you can let it convict you. So, I think when people sit around and then they make it about them, that's another issue. Just like, oh, I'm so sad. I hate that this is happening. I'm so sad, but I'm not going to necessarily do anything about it. I feel like I'm stuck. I don't know what to do about it. And I think that when people feel like that, it could be a level of conviction if you take it and you use it to do good, which means researching yourself, which means teaching your children, which means combating racism in your own heart in your own home, in your own family, which also means looking at, and not to get political, looking at what you're voting for, looking at what you're standing for, looking at what you're entertaining yourself with, looking at what's really, really important in your life. I had a friend of mine who were talking about this at one point, and she was saying to me, you know, her children are white. One of her husband's brothers is a racist, and she just said he is, and she said, he makes Black jokes at the holidays and stuff like that, and she said, I just ignore it. And I said, well, you're teaching your children to be racist. And she was like, well, how is that? You know, I don't tell them. I said, but when you're not actively combating what he is saying in front of them, you are teaching your children that this is okay. Because nobody's saying that Uncle whatever his name is not okay. Nobody's saying that. And I think that, to me, when I look at white guilt, I think, you know, when people learn, there's always a level of guilt. When you hear about something, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this was happening. I don't know what to do. You have to do something with it. And I think that's that difference. Take that guilt, don't walk in that guilt, but walk in becoming an ally, a true ally, becoming an anti-racist, and doing the work, you know, to support your brothers and sisters of color.
Well said.
Great. Well, again, I want to thank you all for just your generosity of time, for you sharing with us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Well, what a tremendous gift these folks have been to us. Such a blessing. And I hope if you know these folks that you get a chance to thank them. It's a very vulnerable thing they've done. And actually, they've given a lot of time that you have not seen on camera, as we've had discussions around this. And so I want to thank them again. And I hope that you felt blessed by their participation. They'll be back next week. And then the following week, we thought it'd be kind of fun, since it's called Asking for a Friend. I've had the opportunity to ask them specific questions. Would you like to ask them some questions? And so not next week, but the following week, we're going to have a time where you get to share some questions you may have for them. This could be about race. It could be about how they've experienced certain things. It could be about words. It could be about just questions you ask. These will be anonymous. You'll be asking for a friend. You can email me or message me on Facebook, and I will keep your question anonymous. And we'll just have a time where we get to ask them some questions. So hope you're looking forward to that. So let's pray together. God, we're grateful for the way that you teach us and learn us and grow us and challenge us. God, I continually ask that you would give the Central community this ability to live our lives with open hands, that we would be generous toward our love for you and our love for others. I pray, God, that we would be people who release our clutching, that we would be people who take on the very nature of a servant, and that we would reflect your incredible likeness to the world around us. And now, just a quick benediction. You know, so many of us have been wrestling with there's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now. We've got these kind of conversations that have been happening globally as a nation around race. We've got an election coming up that is creating just incredible tension and pressure. And we're dealing with a global pandemic and all of the stuff around that in terms of the way it's affecting our mental health and our kids and our education and you know, our jobs and our economy. There is so much. And so would you just receive this benediction? In the name of Christ, I just speak peace to you. May you know of the peace that passes all understanding, all comprehension. May you know that there is a God on the throne who deeply loves you, who is working all things to your good, to the world around us, that there is a redemptive arc to this world, and God is on the throne. And may you be filled with peace and joy and love and patience and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. Peace of Christ be with you.